Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for another episode of Ships of War, the series in which I look at historic warships, the famous, the not so famous, and in some cases the downright notorious, and in addition to situating them in their historical context, I'll also look at the way they're presented in a particular game system and try to gauge, based on their historic performance and also how they perform in said game system, just how fairly they've been treated and how accurately they've been portrayed by the design of the game. And today I'm going to return to the last game I reviewed on this channel, which was Jack Greene's Tsushima, and that's the original Tsushima from the 1980s rather than his more modern, up-to-date iteration. And the two ships that I'm going to be picking on this time are the Japanese armoured cruiser Izumo and the Russian armoured cruiser, the Rossia. Now, these two have quite a lot to recommend them. They both participated heavily in operations during the Russo-Japanese War, and on the 14th of August 1904, the two actually fought each other at the Battle of Ulsan. Now, they weren't always firing directly at each other, but Admiral Yessen's squadron of the three Russian armoured cruisers were pitted against Kamimura's four armoured cruisers, with some lighter vessels participating. And as these two ships were the flagships on their respective sides, it seems that they're, to me at any rate, that they are natural choices for a comparison. They're also, as we will see, spectacularly beautiful ships. Armoured cruisers of the period, I find, generally were very good looking. And these two are definitely among the best of the bunch. Now, just to warn you all, my cat Oscar is in the vicinity and he's feeling particularly mischievous tonight. So if you find the camera shakes, or yes, as Oscar's very kindly demonstrating, or if you suddenly get bits of paw or tail intruding on the picture, I do apologize. He's just feeling a little bit, as I say, mischievous. But let's start, and going for age before beauty, again, these things are relative, let's look at the Rossia. So I'm just going to bring in a photograph of the Rossia as she appeared when first commissioned into the Imperial Russian Navy. So this was taken in or about 1897. And the newly completed Rossia, as you can see, is a very, very impressive warship. For one thing, she's enormous. You can tell by the size of the smaller guns, the anti-torpedo boat, anti-destroyer guns, and by that gentleman down there who's probably painting the side of the ship. She is not a small ship. So when fully loaded, she displaced something in the region of about 13,700 tons, give or take. If she was really supplied up to the nines for a long voyage, she'd probably be creeping towards 14,000 tons. She'd been designed for a bit less than that, but as is often the case with these things, the displacement went up as the design developed. When one looks at her dimensions, she certainly was no slouch in the size department. So allowing for the difficulties of establishing an overall length when you've got a fairly pronounced ram bow over there. We're looking at a ship that was about 480 feet in overall length, maybe somewhat over, and with a beam of 68.5 feet. So she is very, very large. To put it into context, a lot of contemporary battleships were in the 400-foot length area. So this is a fairly big ship. Oh, here comes the cattail. There we go. So quite a large vessel and also very impressively armed. So as designed, this ship carried 4 8-inch guns and 16 6-inch guns, not to mention a battery of lighter weapons, which I'd indicated earlier. No, Oscar. Move. There's a good cat. So quite a formidably equipped ship. She was a follow-on to the previous Russian armoured cruiser design, which was the Rurik. Now, the Rurik, when she was first launched a couple of years before, excuse me, she made a splash in more ways than one because much had been promised about the capabilities of this ship, particularly with regards her speed. And in the Rossia, the Russians promised to do even better. Now, this was a worry for the nations with whom Russia had a naval rivalry. And one of these concerned nations was actually Britain. Now, if that seems a bit strange, given the disparity of strength between the Royal Navy and the Imperial Russian Navy, it's not because the British feared the Russian Navy in a head-on collision. It was certainly a large force, but the British had a fairly shrewd idea that the quality of the ships in the Russian Navy was fairly uneven. What scared them about ships like the Rossia was its capacity to serve as an extremely powerful and effective commerce raider, effectively threatening the economic strength that underpinned the British Empire. So a ship with her speed, and she could reach and maintain 20 knots fairly easily. It was quite an achievement. Meant that she could outrun a lot of Britain's more powerful warships while potentially picking off merchant ships and smaller, faster cruisers at her leisure. So definitely one to worry about. And as Russian imperial ambitions began to turn eastwards, in fact, by the time Rossia entered service, the Japanese were very, very wary of Russian intentions. Ships like the Rossia were bad news for them too. Now, I will go into these in more detail a bit later, but behind all this outward impressiveness, the Rossia did have a few problems. And in many respects, she was, as she's often been described, an unfortunate design. But I'll go into those a bit later when I'm comparing the two ships in more detail. But for now, let's look at her opposite number. And this is the Izumo. This was taken somewhat later in her career during the First World War. So you'll notice she has that gunnery spotting top on her foremast. She would not have had that as originally completed. It would have actually looked a lot more like her mainmast. The primary purpose of these when the ships were completed was signalling. So Izumo is completed a few years after the Rossia. She enters service in 1900 with the Japanese Navy, so just a few years later. She is a powerfully armed armoured cruiser. She's fast. Like the Rossia, she can also make 20 knots and maintain it for a reasonably long time, and she's got good range and endurance. Perhaps slightly less endurance than the Rossia in terms of her coal bunkerage. The other thing that's noteworthy is that she's significantly smaller. So, unlike the hulking Rossia, which topped out at well over 13,000 tons, fully loaded, the Izumo barely reached 10,000 tons. In fact, she was closer to the 9,800 tons mark. And although she was as beamy as the Rossia, about 68 foot and a smidge, she was significantly shorter. So length overall on this ship was about 434 foot, give or take. So you're looking at a ship that's somewhere in the region of 40 to 50 feet shorter. But even so, an extremely large and impressive vessel, as you can see by the working boats she has alongside her. So quite a large and hefty ship. The armament was remarkably similar to Rossia's. In fact, one could almost be forgiven for thinking the same individual had submitted a design specification to two different navies. So, like the Rossia, 4 8-inch guns were the primary battery. She had 14 6-inch guns as opposed to the Russian 16. Both had a myriad of lighter weapons, and torpedo tubes were mounted, two on each broadside. The Russian had extra, at least one extra in the bow, and some sources report another one in the stern, but I'm not sure if she actually had that. So, yes, quite well matched ships in terms of the armament, and on paper, very worthy adversaries. However, as we'll see, there were certain things going on that made the Izumo, in my opinion, a much more formidable ship. And some of them you might actually be able to get a sense of from the visual clues. So notice with Izumo, we've got turrets there. Those are the turrets for the 8-inch main battery. Now, as I say, on paper, they're the same number of guns. The guns were of roughly equal size and equal quality when you look at the ballistics and details like muzzle velocity. Actually, if anything, the Russian 8-inch might have been a slightly better design. But the problem was the way in which they were sighted. Now, I've pointed out the 8-inch turrets on the Izumo, and you can see her secondary guns are nicely grouped there. Let's go back to the photo of the Rossia. No, you didn't miss them. The reason you can't see, or you're struggling to see, equivalent turrets for the 8 inches is because she simply did not have them. What you can see is one of her 8-inch guns in a sponson there, and another one which is not really in view, or perhaps barely, back there. Same arrangement on the other side. Now you can see the problem there, and just to make it a little bit clearer, I'll get rid of this, and I'll bring in my old friend Fred T. Jane. Now, for those of you who might be new to my Ships of War channel, I rely on Fred Jane a lot because the illustrations in Jane's fighting ships are very, very useful. But he does come with a couple of health warnings in that the information on these was the information that he had at the time, and subsequent research has often found that he was very slightly off. Forgivably so, given that, not everyone would want to blab the details of their ships, giving advantage to the enemy and all that. So you'd want to overemphasize the strengths of your vessels a little. So certain details like the armor have to be treated with a pinch of salt. Not all of those armor densities are accurate. And of course, the quality of the information is variable. The Russians did give Jane access to information about their ships, but as it turned out, they weren't quite as honest as they could have been. Whereas he enjoyed much greater access to either British or British-designed ships, like the Idzumo and her sister, the Iwate. So, of course, the information here is going to be a bit better. The only other thing I tend to warn people about is this bit down here. So that is not an accurate reflection of the internal subdivision. It is, in fact, Jane's abstracted system of tracking a ship's flotation for his naval war game. So that bit of housekeeping done, let's get back to the arrangement of the guns. So you have the 8-inch guns on the Japanese cruiser in turrets, which of course will have beautiful arcs of fire all round the ship. And what's really important is that whichever side she's fighting an enemy on, the Idzumo can bring all 4 of her 8-inch guns to bear. Let's have a look at the situation with the Rossia. So there's her 2 forward 8-inch guns, and there's her 2 after ones. Now, what's immediately apparent from the profile is that these guns have no cross-deck firing ability. So at most, she's only going to be bringing 2 guns to bear at any one time. The other problem these guns have is because of the sheer size of the ship. there is no real way of coordinating their gunfire. Now, the Japanese were nowhere near having any kind of director firing system either. But the beauty of having a turret is that you have your built-in aiming devices, usually sighting telescopes in this era, and you have two guns under the control of a single officer. On the Russian arrangement, you're simply firing your weapons out into the whatever you can see, but you've got no way, partly because there's so much in the way, of communicating with the other gun crew and trying to coordinate. So this ship, by design, is very much a close-range melee weapon. They're all about hail of fire at distances where you don't have to worry about coordinated fire. Now, the Japanese ship represents a step closer to a more modern approach where you're starting to look at long-range fire. You've also got a much more weatherly arrangement because those turrets are fully enclosed, so if the weather is horrendous, you can still fight them. The Russian guns are behind open shields, which is not brilliant in the slightest. Excuse me, sorry. The situation is only slightly better when you look at their secondary armament. The Rossia had a nice big, fairly open battery space. But then when you come to these broadside weapons, it matters a bit less anyway. The Japanese arrangement is somewhat similar, except that the guns are better protected. Now, how does this look in game terms? What firepower have they been given relative to each other? I'm just going to move Jane out the way for a second and just straighten this out so we can see it. So looking purely at the gunnery factors, these icons here show the main armament. And I think they've nicely captured Rossia's problem in that, you know, her weaponry is effectively split down the middle. Those little lines show you the angles of train. So the Izumo, of course, can bring 13 firepower factors from her main guns to bear on either broadside, which is a significantly harder punch than the Rossia's 8. So I think that's really nicely modelled there. The Rossia's lighter guns do have an advantage over the Idzumo. I think that giving the Izumo only 13 factors, as opposed to the Rossia's 15, is probably giving the Russian maybe a bit too much of an advantage, but that point is a debatable one. The important thing is that they have again captured the correct layout and the capabilities of these guns. So, I mean, Rossia did have an advantage in numbers. I mean, 1 6-inch gun more per side than her Japanese counterpart. So, yes, I'll let them have that one. And then, of course, we have the lighter guns. Now, they've been a little bit kinder to the Rossia here again, but I think that's fair enough. The ship was significantly larger than the Izumo, and she could definitely accommodate more of the anti-destroyer, anti-torpedo boat guns than the Japanese vessel could. So that is a fair one. Now, the other thing you probably picked up on when we were looking at the drawings from Jane's is the armor distribution. So without going too much into the details, you can see the Japanese ship is quite well protected. In keeping with the way the British tended to do these things, you've got a waterline belt which thickens around what they would have called the citadel area, basically from about the beginning of the fore turret through to the after one. And you've got reasonably thick armor there. which extends upwards to protect the turret trunking. You've got the armor on the turrets, and these casemates for the secondary armament all enjoy protection, as does the conning tower. Now, this was a pretty decent setup because all the ship's vitals are protected, and this handy armoured box is a good use of armour because not only does it protect your machinery spaces, or at least the bits of them that are above water, it also looks after the ammunition hoists for all your guns, your primary and your secondary guns. Now, before I move on to look at the equivalent drawing for Rossia, there's an important point that needs to be made here, which is that Rossia's armour in places was significantly thicker than Izumo's. In fact, Rossia's thickest belt armour was 8 inches thick, as opposed to Izumo's 7 inches. And her conning tower was 12 inches. So quite a heavily armoured ship, you would think, but in fact, her armour arrangement was much weaker than Izumo's, and let's have another look at why. Now, keep this image in mind because it's going to be very important when we look at this. So when you look at the Rossia's armour, yes, there's very, very dense protection in and around the waterline, with some slightly raised areas to cover machinery spaces and the base of some ammunition tubes. You've also got this very thin set of lines to show extra plating around the top of the machinery spaces. So there's some protection, but what is overwhelmingly clear is how unprotected this huge area of hull is. So you have a ship that's basically an enormous target, especially in a close range engagement, and she's got hardly any armor above water at all. The guns are only protected behind really thin shields. The secondary battery on the main deck particularly was protected. You can see that thin line there, but that was only by bulkheads fore and aft. So unlike the Japanese ship, where if you remember, there were casemates with individual protection, so they would effectively be self-contained units, the Rossia's entire battery space is open and not reinforced in any significant way. Now that's a very, very serious flaw. And you can see it in the cross-section as well. There's your very thick armour protecting the vitals for a very thin slice around the waterline, and then you've got the armoured deck. But all the space above it is very, very pitifully protected. And when we look at the Japanese arrangement again, that is a much more comprehensive protection scheme. And again, in the cross-section, you can see you've got armour covering most of the side to varying degrees. Admittedly, this is a cross-section through one of the casemates, so you'd be looking at that bit or that bit. But you've got a decently sloped armour deck with a coal bunker the other side of it, and then more armour over there. And you've also got the cellular subdivision on the Japanese ship. So that although she was much smaller, she wasn't too far behind the Russian ship in terms of flotation and being able to survive underwater damage. The Russian ship does have some, but on a ship this large, when they could have built in a bit more, it doesn't seem that she was that much more efficient in the anti-flooding regard than the Idzumo. Jane has been quite generous in crediting her with, he's given her a flotation rating of 18, as opposed to 15 for the Izumo. Now, I think the reason Jane did that was to account for the much greater mass of the Rossia, and the fact that she had more spaces that could be flooded if it came to it. In the game, the the two have been given equivalent underwater damage ratings, which I think is probably fair. What is a bit less fair, and one of the elements in this design that I take issue with regard to these two ships, is the armor rating. The Izumo's been rated a 3 and the Rossia a 2. Now 2 is a grade higher than 3, which means that, no, thank you, which means that the Rossia is able to shrug off hits in the game better than the Izumo. And I don't think that is the case at all. Now, to be fair, it's hard to say because Izumo's armor was not tested to anything like the degree that Rossia's was tested at the Battle of Ulsan. Although Izumo's sister Iwate did take a very bad hit, which started a serious fire. But even then, that doesn't give you quite enough data. Luckily, we do have quite a few photographs that were taken of the Rossia after the Battle of Ulsan. And you can see the price that the Russian ship paid for this design omission. She's been quite heavily hit, as you can see, and every shot has told. In fact, the smaller holes, ironically, are actually bad news for the interior of the ship because it means that the shells have been able to penetrate before bursting inside, which is not what you want. You really want them to be bursting harmlessly on the side armor, or at least expending most of their force on the side armor. But you can see that the ship really did go through the ringer. What was demonstrated at Ulsan was the remarkable survivability of the Russian ships, which, despite horrendous damage, Rossia and Gromoboy were able to maintain their speed and escape. Rurik was less fortunate and was sunk in the action. But despite all this horrific damage and some quite serious fires and heavy casualties, the other two Russian armoured cruisers did very well in making a getaway. So the only other element that is related to armor and survivability is the hull. This is the chunk that you use to mark off hull damage and progressive flooding as the ships take hits. Izumo comes off slightly worse than Rossia. That, I think, is fair because I think the composition of these boxes are based on data compiled from the ship's tonnages. And that makes sense because when you're looking at mass and space that's available to be flooded, I mean, the Rossia at the end of the day was a bigger ship. So I think that is a fair rating. What about the speed? Because the last bit here, these boxes are meant to show the degradation of a ship's speed as she takes damage, so you gradually cross them off. And the way the game works is that you have different phases where the different speed ratings are used. Now, interestingly, the Izumo has been given a rating of 5.5 and the Rossia a 5.4. I don't really understand the reason for that because both of them, throughout their service lives, or at least Izumo until she was hobbled by post-war treaties, were able to maintain a very similar speed. As I said earlier, it was about 20 knots for both ships. And even in her damaged state after Ulsan, the Rossia showed that she could sprint. So why she's been slightly hobbled there is a bit beyond me. She really ought to have another box there with a 5 in it. So I think the game has been very slightly unfair to her there. Now, you could argue that some of the Russian ships might have been in poor repair because of the slight inadequacy of the facilities at Vladivostok. I mean, they trying to get a vessel like the Rossia in to have her hull cleaned properly would have been difficult. And of course, she was sheathed for tropical service. But the fact remains that at the Battle of Ulsan, she was able to make an effective getaway and show Admiral Kamimura a clean pair of heels, despite the state she was in, and significantly, as observers noticed, despite some serious damage to her funnels and ventilation systems, which was something that would have really affected her speed at the time. So if she could still sprint with all of that, then I think she does deserve a better speed rating than the game has given her. So overall, I think that the game has been reasonably fair to the two ships. They've come out pretty well as they should have done, I think, in terms of the armament. There are some things that puzzle me, like the disparity in the armor rating, which favors the Russian ship. Now, that's something I just can't fathom out. If it was based purely on armor thickness, it would make sense. But as we've seen, distribution is just as important as armor thickness. And on the armor distribution front, the Rossia is miles behind the Izumo. Not only that, but when the Rossia was completed, when her armor was installed, the most modern that was available to the Russians was Harvey nickel steel. When Izumo was completed a few years later, Krupp cemented armor, which was a much superior type, had come into use. And so when you consider that the thickest side armor on the Rossia was 8 inches of Harvey nickel steel, the 7 inches on the belt of the Izumo, given that it was Krupp's armor, if anything, probably had greater protective properties than the armor on the Rossia. So really, if anything, I think that should be the other way around. I've already touched on the speed and why I think that she deserves the Rossia deserves a better speed rating for sure. And then lastly, there's their value. Now, Rossia comes out in the game worth an extra victory point. Again, I'm not really sure why, because overall, it seems to me that the Izumo was the much superior ship. Rossia was, as I said at the beginning, an outwardly impressive vessel. But if we come back once more to James's illustration, we can see that behind all this outward impressiveness, she did have some very, very serious problems. And there were certain elements of her design that weren't really all that efficient. So you can see she's got a triple screw arrangement as opposed to the Izumo, which is a twin screw ship. You can't really see it on Izumo's arrangement there, but she was a twin screw. The curious thing about Rossia's arrangement is that the center screw was purely for cruising, and they would actually feather the other two props when she was moving at low speed on this screw. When she needed to sprint, they would use the outer shafts, and that one would be either left to feather or they could disconnect it internally. What actually is impressive to my mind is they could actually still reach 20 knots with the awkwardness and the drag that must have created. So quite an impressive achievement there, although probably not the best way to have done it. The other thing that strikes me as very odd about the Rossia is how she has this combination of really modern features such as electrical ammunition hoists to all her guns. Very great for labour saving, although potentially problematic if something happens like battle damage to knock your electrical systems offline. And yet in other respects, this modernity rubs shoulders with protective arrangements and design features which are frankly almost primitive by comparison. Again, a very unfortunate design that had a lot of promise, but in the end left a lot to be desired. And then you have the smaller but much more efficiently arranged Izumo, which arguably is a much more effective fighting vessel. There really was not. I can't think of any area in which, or at least any area that critically mattered, in which these ships were the inferior of their Russian counterpart. Izumo and Iwate, and indeed their squadron mates, were exactly what the Imperial Japanese Navy needed. The Russian ships, by contrast, were decent enough ships in their own right, but they, as the war experience proved, they were only really effective in the commerce raiding role, coming up against a ship as heavily armed as themselves and with better distribution of armament and armor, made for a very disastrous engagement in which they lost one of their number, and the other two were so badly knocked about that they didn't really play any significant part in the remainder of the Russo-Japanese War. So there we go, my brief cook's tour of the Rossia and the Idzumo as they are presented in Jack Greene's Tsushima. I hope you found that enjoyable and interesting. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes of Ships of War, I would love to hear them. As always, comments, queries, corrections are all welcome. I'd really love to hear from you if you've got something to say. If you've got an insight to add about these ships that I might have missed, please do. Share it with everyone. It would be great to hear from you. Most importantly, and I guess it just remains for me to say, a huge thank you to all of you who've been following this series and indeed the other videos I've done. It's always splendid to have your company, and I really appreciate the time you guys have taken watching these videos. To all my veterans, as always, a massive hello to you guys. Thank you very much. It's great to have you along for the ride. To anyone who might be visiting my channel for the first time, you're more than welcome. If it's naval history or this particular game that brought you here, I hope you liked this video, and do look at the other 3 that I've done on this title by Jack Greene. If it's wargaming in general that's brought you here, then you're still more than welcome. Please do have a wander around the channel. Hopefully there'll be some other material that you like, and I certainly hope I'll see you again. But whoever you are and wherever you're watching from, thank you very much for tuning in. All the very best to you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care. Bye.